I'd like to introduce our panel on sustaining smaller NGOs during the COVID era. And our moderator today is Smarinita Shetty. She is the co-founder and CEO of the India Development Review. And before that, she was with Avasara. She has more than 20 years of experience leading functions across strategy, experience in operations, sales, and business development. So Smarinita, welcome, and over to you.
Welcome everyone to this panel. I think in the earlier two panels, you got a sense of what philanthropy looked like and what some of the nonprofits and collaboratives that were happening on the field. This one will focus on how nonprofits in India, smaller nonprofits, actually dealt with the crisis and what their future looks like. So with me today, I have four outstanding leaders. And I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes just introducing all four of them. We have Akhila Srinivasan, who is the Vice President of Single Teacher School. She's also the Managing Director of Shriram Life Insurance, as well as the Managing Trustee for Shriram Foundation, which she helped set up almost 20 years ago. We also have Guneeta Singh Bhalla, who's the founder of the 1947 Partition Archive, which is an ongoing movement to crowdsource oral histories of the partition. We have Roopa Purushothaman, who's the founder of Avasara. It's an educational institution that works with some of India's brightest girls to kind of help achieve their leadership potential. She also sits on the board of TCS Foundation, and she's the chief economist and head of policy and advocacy at the Tata Group. And finally, we have Vanessa De Souza, who's the CEO of SNEHA. It is an organization that works in the field of child health and nutrition, and a lot of their work happens in urban slums of Mumbai, especially around Dharavi. So between them, they cover a wide spectrum of experience, right? So whether it's in the organizations they run, the work they do, or the people that they serve. And interestingly, a couple of them, both Roopa and Akhila, straddle both sides of the spectrum, on the giving side as well as the doing. So we have the benefit of getting like a twin perspective from both of them. So before I set the ball rolling and give some context, I just thought it might be good to kind of say, what are the goals of this panel, right? I mean, what are we going to spend the next half an hour talking about? And I think one is to kind of help all of y'all understand what the impact of the pandemic has been on smaller organizations. But second is to also get a sense from and to learn from these leaders on what their strategies were in terms of dealing with it, and what's the support they would like from, say, funders and partners. I'm going to spend very little time setting context because I think we'd rather hear from them and their diverse experiences. But just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective on what the last 6 months have been like. So the pandemic, I mean, a lot of y'all know, hit India in around March. And on March 23rd, like a lockdown was imposed. And it was one of the most stringent lockdowns in the world. And what that meant is it played out in a few different ways, right? Especially with the development sector. So every NGO pretty much had to stop the work, their core work, right? So whether they were working on education, whether it was livelihoods, whether it was gender or human rights, they pretty much had to stop that piece of work. And all of them became first responders in a sense. They started working on relief, providing food supplies, rations, making sure migrants reached home. And again, you got a flavor of some of this in the earlier panel. The second thing that happened was on the funding side. So by then, a lot of funding had already been allocated to their core programs, right? But when they had to do some of this relief work and response work, they still needed money. And what happened at the same time is the government announced the PM Cares Fund, which sucked out a lot of the corporate money, the CSR money that otherwise might have been allocated to some of these nonprofits. So in the midst of some of that, what they also had to do is get creative about how they raised money. So they ended up doing crowdsourcing. They reached out to friends and family. They reached out to strangers. And some of them might tell you about the stories around having to look at different sources of funding. So disruption, in a sense, happened at 3 levels, right? The work they did, the funding that was available, and most importantly, all of this happened in like a lockdown kind of situation. But I think what's a bigger challenge is the fact that going forward, it's probably not going to get any easier, right? So CSR money is going to continue to shrink. International funding is likely to get affected because some of you know that we have new FCRA laws right now. And most importantly, while all of this is happening, the need of the communities, in a sense, is just going to be stronger, right? The communities are getting more vulnerable. There are loss of livelihoods. There are healthcare issues. Children are not going to school. So all of this is happening. And we will kind of get like a perspective on each one of these aspects, from our four panelists. And maybe, we can start with you, Guneeta and Roopa. If you could speak, if you could tell our audience here what the impact of the pandemic has been on the organizations that you have run, both in terms of have you had to change your program or business model, and or think about like what you had to prioritize, right, given the situation that we're in. So maybe we could start with Guneeta. Guneeta, you're on mute. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So, in our case, we've always been a global organization. We've been very digital from the get-go because we document oral histories and we enable the public to do this. And so our reach has been in 12 different countries. So how do you do that with a very tiny budget? You do that online. So in a way, we were we had a head start going into the pandemic in terms of our programs. We were able to very quickly pivot to a completely online sort of system for our core operations. But the negative impact for us was that a lot of our donors, they wanted to focus, they diverted the limited funding that there is in the funding pool in India. They diverted it to something that we also believe was a very important cause at the time, which is what happened to the migrant workers, which is what we just talked about for the last hour. So what that did is it took away a lot of funding from smaller NGOs like ours, which still do have a little bit of that hamster wheel fundraising mechanism because we don't have huge endowments and so on to keep us going for years. We still raise funding year on year for every year. And so it did impact that for us as our funders moved away from funding us and into the immediate crisis at hand. But what we did is, because we were already very digital, we were already plugged in, we had a huge social media presence, we had 1 million followers, so we turned to them. So we didn't ask for funds. What we did is we increased our online programming. We created an online talk show, like a first of its kind talk show on history and how the history impacts, the social sort of culture we're seeing today in South Asia and why that's so important. So we had, a lot of really interesting engagement like that on a bunch of online platforms like Facebook and Instagram and so on, Twitter, YouTube. And a lot of small donations started to pour in that way. So what happened is we ended up acquiring new donors and we ended up creating a new stream of funding when our traditional stream started to get impacted. And, to be honest, that new stream has not been as, it hasn't met our goals necessarily, but it's definitely been a shift. And in terms of our programs, we shifted from having people going in person to do the interviews to actually doing the interviews using online tools like Zoom, like the one that we're using, and Skype. So it enabled even greater reach. Now we're in more countries than we were in before. I think you're muted. I think you're still on mute.
Sorry. No, yeah, I couldn't unmute it. Roopa, sorry, do you want to speak a bit about what you had to prioritize and how your business model or program changed?
Sure. So, we run a school. We have a little less than 400 girls, and we're a mix of residential as well as kids who commute every day. And so, for us, as soon as the pandemic hit, we had to, one, as many organizations had to do, sort of just pivot to the immediate needs that our students and their families were facing. So we had, students who needed rations, we needed to think about food and sort of basic necessities. We had other students and family members who, had health issues. So we had some who had COVID and we had to take care of the care for COVID, but we also have a number of family members who had other health issues. And so I think just as a school, you play a role which is much more than academics, but it's not that we had all of the resources at our disposal to understand how to do this in lockdown. So I think trying to figure out, at least on our side, for the numbers that we had, we could sort it out. But I think we found that it was really expanding the set of sort of skills that we had on the table. So I think that was the first big sort of pivot. And those are big questions for an organization that you have to make very quickly, right? Is this something that we should be doing? How far do we go on this? How much can we take on? And how do we do it at a time when we have complete lockdown? So that was the first set of things. I think the second set is, again, as a school, we had to figure out how to shift our program totally online. And, we didn't have that figured out from the beginning. So, our kids don't have devices. Many of them had access maybe to their parents' mobiles for a couple of hours a day. We had to think about how to translate academics to an asynchronous program. We had to make all these decisions about how to do that on a mobile-friendly platform. But it's not just the academics. There's also a big, social and emotional wellness program. There's advisory. There's a ton of other stuff that you have to figure out how to turn online. So I think this is still ongoing. And one of the things that's good about this is that I think it's part of a shift in our business model that's going to have to take place anyway. I think we're going to live in a world where we have a more hybrid model of in-person and digital learning. And I'd say a pro of this is that I think our teachers are really buying into the fact that they can see data on students that really translates into how to tailor learning towards them. But obviously it's not ideal, and we just don't have the touch points that you have, when you're living with kids day to day, and you can see how they're learning, and you can see spontaneous interactions between, peer-to-peer take place and so on. So I would say those are a couple of the things that have really, have been big shocks to the system, obviously, for a school. In terms of funding, for us, we have a smaller group of funders, and I think that we were really hit because the smaller companies, the companies that were heavily geared towards finance, towards high-touch services, and they were themselves so heavily affected, they weren't able to fund us. So you have to juggle, and I think in some ways we had that experience with us, but I think it's tough and it's ongoing. I think the other big challenge for us was that lockdown hit at the time when our first set of 12th standard kids were getting into universities, and some of them got into universities in the US. It's not exactly the best time to be asking people to help fund scholarships, when there are a lot of other priorities taking place. So I think we've just had to shift. I think we couldn't do it in this big box sort of format, but we've just had to find different funders and donors come to the fore. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that, I just want to reiterate the point that was made earlier, that I think it really does make us think hard about how to make other funders more comfortable, or how to think about longer term sustainability options like a corpus, like an endowment, and how to get that to be something, when you have kids for 7 years of their lives, we can't be chasing things like this. And in the future, there's only going to be more of these kinds of shocks. So I think that's something that we're having a lot of conversations with funders.
Yeah, thank you both Roopa and Guneeta. And I think it's interesting. As leaders, you have to balance both, like the operational side of things as well as the funding, right? And I can imagine very long days and very long nights just trying to, cope with that. Roopa, will come to the bit where you spoke a little bit about corpus and the need to have an endowment. But Vanessa, if we can go to you, a lot of your work was around around the slums in Mumbai, where a lot of, we felt the impact, right? As,
right.
As lockdown came into place, as, migrants started going home. And a lot of your work was actually around Dharavi. And today Dharavi is now being showcased as something that both Mumbai, Maharashtra, as well as India got right. So could you speak a bit to some of the learnings from your work in Dharavi, and how do we make sure that there's no second wave, right? Which is again something that we're beginning to see both in other countries, but also in our country as well.
Sure. So just to give a little context to those people who don't know Dharavi, Dharavi is one of the most densely populated slums. It's one of the largest slums of Asia. And I think when the first case hit on the 1st of April, and in fact, the person unfortunately died that day, there was complete panic. And, everyone thought Dharavi would actually convert into a graveyard. But there are a few things that worked very well. And I think it's really important for us to highlight what works well, because there are a lot of lessons that we can take from that. The first is the way communities came together. And when I say communities, I mean everybody, from the government to the private providers, to religious leaders, to political leaders, to the residents of the area, how they all came together to fight this pandemic. There was an extremely proactive assistant municipal commissioner, and I think decentralizing power to the ward office was one of the reasons why Dharavi was able to move very quickly to address the pandemic. The community participation was outstanding. You saw private providers who normally were at loggerheads with the public health system coming together to help with door-to-door testing, screening. And NGOs and organizations like SNEHA have large volunteers that live within these slums. And we were able to leverage and mobilize all these volunteers to actually help with door-to-door screening, identification, tracing, convincing people to go to quarantine, communicating preventive measures. All these efforts certainly helped in many ways to prevent the spread of the virus. You had the donors who played a very critical role. In fact, one of the people, Amit Chandra, who's in this group, I think donors came in and helped NGOs like us to provide food to families within the containment areas, and that allowed them to stay within the containment areas. The other thing that worked very well were people gave spaces for quarantine. So schools, marriage halls, go-downs that were working, that were not being used, were all given up for quarantine, and that's what really helped to stem the spread of the virus. If you look at how we prevent the second wave, I think one, of course, the basic preventive measures, and I think communication about the basic preventive measures is absolutely critical. Most of the slum communities are now in a completely different zone. They're all focused on getting livelihood. So in fact, a study that SNEHA conducted, we did a need assessment to understand what were the needs of these communities, the new emerging needs that we could address. And though we are a health NGO, we are forced to look at aspects like livelihood, wages, social protection, ensuring food security through strengthening of the public distribution system. So I think more than the second wave, I think we have to address their own needs, which are economic needs, financial needs, food security needs. Unfortunately, neither the vaccine or a drug is going to help these aspects. The other thing that we have to do again as a community is make it easy for people to get back to work. So we know that these vulnerable informal settlements have large numbers of small shops, factories, etc. And we have to help them to follow safety norms so that people can come back to work and people can start earning a livelihood together. And the last point I want to talk about is mental health. Unfortunately, in all this aspect of physical health, we've completely forgotten about the mental health. The level of stress in these communities is so high today that unless we do something very proactively to address mental health, gender-based violence, these are going to have long-term repercussions on other health aspects. If we as a community do not work on these basic preventive, promotive, physical health as well as mental health, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to prevent a second wave.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I think one of the interesting points you made was how funders and came together and kind of supported nonprofits in the work that they had to do at the moment. Akhila, if I could ask you, and then maybe Roopa after Akhila speaks as well, is both of you all straddle the giving side as well as you all run nonprofits as well. Are there learnings on one side of the equation that you can actually kind of take to the other side because you all have a better understanding of the pulls and pushes of being both a nonprofit as well as a funder? So Akhila, if you could speak to some of your learnings of having been a funder and how that's worked as you run single teacher school and the other way around.
Yes. You know, the Shriram group to which I belong, I'm one of the directors of the group, is one of the very large and respected non-banking finance companies. This group also has very large life and general insurance ventures. And over the last 25 years, the Shriram Foundation has been very active in the fields of education, training, skill development, livelihood creation for the marginalized youth and marginalized women. Today, through various programs all over the country, every nook and corner of the country, we probably impact more than 2.5 lakh lives. And all these projects are managed well. And the way we review a company's progress, where there is accountability, transparency, review mechanism in place, appraisal, the same yardsticks we bring to the social work that we do through the foundation. And therefore, there's immense commitment and accountability. And as a corporate citizen, we strongly believe that it is our foremost duty to give back to the society. And in this COVID situation, from the month of April, May, June, the first quarter, most of the companies in India and abroad also had seen their revenues falling, and there was tremendous uncertainty in the segments in which various businesses operated, and we were no exception. And together, if I review the last 2 quarters, our group probably 20-25% of the total revenue has been hit, and we are trying to make up as much as possible in the next 2 quarters. Now, this fact being given, how do we manage our CSR spend? So as you know, the regulation says that 2% of the average net profits for the last 3 years we take and spend, and we have been strictly following this. And we are just, fortunately, in all this training, skill development for women, children, education, running our schools, we run scholarship programs of 70-80,000 scholarships being given to low-income Indian truck operators, families, drivers, cleaners, because we are an NBFC that finances used commercial vehicle sector in India. Now, in these areas, every year we introduce about 20,000 new scholarships. So this year we have tweaked that, and we have brought down the number very substantially. So wherever we had that freedom to tweak the number, we have done it to restrict the cost. But we run our own schools. And in this case, we have paid the salaries for all the teachers, and we have ensured that as much as possible through the online system, we are teaching. So like all corporates, we have also been hit, but I'm sure that the group is pretty large. The profits are very, very substantial in nature, and therefore we may not be as badly hit as others, but nevertheless, we may end up in our CSR spending going down by maximum 15%. That cannot be helped. In this context, I would like to say that public-private partnerships are very essential, because I always think that state governments and central governments, especially in the area of education and healthcare, can choose very large corporates and foundations which are doing exceedingly well in India for many, many, many years. And then the money coming from government sector or other resources coming in, and our expertise in management of projects going together hand in hand can actually help these avenues to flourish. Now, on the other hand, I'm also the vice president of Single Teacher.
Can I come back to you, Akhila? We just go to Roopa and then maybe come back. Yeah. Roopa, you'd spoken earlier about the need for a corpus, right? As a donor, there's very few people are willing to fund corpus. A lot of people are comfortable doing programs and even unrestricted funding, but corpus is a little hard to come by. But as a nonprofit, we all understand the value of having a corpus. And it's something you believe strongly in. So do you want to speak a little bit to that, Roopa?
Yeah, I mentioned it a little bit earlier that I think, there's so much diversity within the kind of work and programs that nonprofits are doing. And I just think that we need to think about models that are a little bit more differentiated according to the type of intervention involved. And from our perspective, when you have deep intervention over many years, it's difficult to be able to make the kinds of commitments that we're making while trying to do yearly funding for operations. And so making the argument for a corpus, and I think there are a lot of reasons for why corpuses are challenging. Maybe it's the returns, maybe it's putting all of that money away when it could be used for growth. Understanding all of that is valid, but I do think for institutions to be able to put some skin in the game, to be able to focus on their core operations and building the kind of credibility and institutions that we want to build in the country, you do need that stability. And so that's why I'm a big proponent of where we can find that sweet spot where it makes sense for people who are really invested in the long run for nonprofits to be able to build a corpus where you can. And whatever else can be said, just that peace of mind to know that you would be able to run basic operations and that your bandwidth isn't on really trying to run around it and finance to get by to the end of the year is huge. So I think that's a conversation that we have with a lot of funders, and it's moving slowly, but I definitely think it's moving in the right direction.
And are you seeing appetite from a particular kind of funders? So are you seeing like individual philanthropists or individuals more open to this idea versus say corporate foundations? I mean, given that you sit on a corporate foundation as well.
Honestly, I think it doesn't come down to the structure of the funding organization. I really just think it comes down to individual personalities. I think there are some people that really understand the fact that you need to have stability for the long run. I think there are others, like I said, who think you could do a lot more good by using the money in the year, and the returns that you get, keep giving it year after year. And then for CSR, obviously there's this big pressure to have to give your 2% every year. And that's going to, you're thinking from a funder's perspective is that I'm going to keep having this come. And that's why in some ways the pandemic really, I think for us being in the middle of a race for a corpus, I think opened a lot of people's eyes to say this isn't some far-flung daydream that you have that you're not going to keep getting funding, but you really do realistically need this. And these kinds of risks are only going to keep occurring. But yeah, I don't think there are some individual philanthropists who really get it and understand it and want to put something towards that. I think there's some corporates, but it really just depends on how people see the investment in the nonprofit itself. Thanks.
And sticking to the funding thing, Vanessa, I mean, if you can speak to, there's been a lot of conversation around FCRA, right? I mean, they just got tabled this week. There's a lot of questions around how it's going to impact us. None of us in the sector really know, but there are also questions on the funding side from international funders and the Indian diaspora saying, what does this mean? So do you have a sense of, I mean, none of us have the answers, but do you have a sense of what it means and how does it impact nonprofits as we see it today?
Yeah. Actually, this is, we're really in a very difficult situation today because because of the economic downturn, we've seen CSR budgets, and we've just heard from Akhila how CSR budgets are shrinking. And in fact, many of us nonprofits were saying, okay, while CSR budgets in India are shrinking, maybe we'll turn to international foundations to fund ourselves. And then bang, we have this FCRA amendment bill coming in. I think it's going to definitely affect small nonprofits who depended on sub-grants from larger nonprofits. And this is especially in rural and tribal areas. I think in cities, you still have the ability to reach donors, corporates, and raise some funding. Smaller organizations in rural and tribal areas where their work is needed the most, they're going to have a big problem. For international funders to fund these organizations is very difficult because sometimes these organizations don't have the systems and the processes and the technology to be able to comply with the needs of international donors. The second big challenge I see is in the reduction of administrative expenses from 50% to 20%. While the administrative expenses of most organizations, when I talk of administrative, I talk about non-program funding, would definitely be well below 50%. I think the challenge is where we have international donors who understand this space, and they come in and fund things like technology, research. And today, we're not going to be able to get that funding. We get unrestricted grants. If I want to pilot something new, I need risk capital. And risk capital comes through an unrestricted grant. I have that flexibility. But if foreign donations have to only go towards programs, 80% of them towards programs, then a lot of these donors that were able to give us this unrestricted funding or funding to build the organization's capacity, that's going to be constrained. So I can see those as two very big issues for us. The rest are more operational issues in terms of governance, approvals, etc. But these are two aspects that I think that will really come in the way of the functioning of nonprofits.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa. I'm cognizant we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of have the last question to Guneeta and Akhila, which is basically saying going forward, we know, like Vanessa mentioned, and like all of you all have said, it's not going to get any better, right? Either on the funding side or how you kind of think about your programs and how you have to like pivot. But could both of you speak to what funders could do going forward to kind of help kind of alleviate the pain in a sense, right? Akhila, speaking from a funding point of view for someone who sits on like a corporate foundation, what could you do to kind of help reduce the pain a bit for nonprofits? And Guneeta, being a nonprofit, what would your ask be of funders, in the year going forward? Can we start with Guneeta and then Akhila?
Okay, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, I know that the migrant crisis is very critical. And, but I also think that the reason that we do have a lot of other nonprofit causes is because those are in some sense very needed as well. And sometimes they are very critical. Sometimes maybe they're not as immediately apparent, what they're doing. But if you've supported NGOs in the past and you have, moved away from that temporarily, I would say to go back and take a look, because all of those NGOs are probably struggling right now. And they're also doing important work. And, an NGO shutting down means that particular cause isn't getting much attention. And so it's not like, in some sense, a company shutting down. It's that particular need, that pain point in society is no longer being tended to. So if you've had nonprofits and causes that you've funded in the past, so I would request that you go back and take a look at them again and those causes, because they probably need you at this time as well.
Thank you. Akhila, funder,
Yeah, I would like to mention that, I'm a part of single teacher schools, which is, I'm the vice president of this NGO. It has nothing to do with the Shriram group, except that Shriram Foundation also supports 200 schools. But then single teacher schools are working in the remotest villages of Tamil Nadu. And this project provides supplementary primary education to the rural poor by taking education to the doorsteps of the villages. So we have 1,057 schools today, evening schools. And in 10 districts of Tamil Nadu, 31,700 children are impacted. So because funding we actually depend on corporate funders, 75% comes from corporate entities, 25% from individual donors. Today we have moved to crowdfunding through Carnatic music programs organized every 10th day. Last 1.5 months, we are present on the Milap platform. And we have been able to raise substantial individual and retail funding. So crowdfunding is one thing. And the single teacher schools, which is 14 years old now in operation, has built a substantial corpus fund till now in the last 8 to 10 years. It's very substantial. So the fixed deposit income from that corpus is also helping us. And I do hope that through this session, we can appeal to the Indiaspora community, which has been so generous in giving. The small drops make an ocean. So individual donors coming forward and giving makes a lot of difference to such NGOs in these times.
Thank you, Akhila. And I think we have a lot to learn from you on how to build a corpus, but also a lot of things that all four of you said. I think there are a lot of learnings, not just for like people who are like givers, but also all of us as nonprofits on how do you kind of pivot your model, how do you kind of sustain fundraising and become agile in like times of crisis, and how do you kind of continue to sustain the model even though times are going to be hard. So I want to thank all of you all for your really valuable inputs and contributions today. And I definitely learned a great deal. I'm guessing our audience did as well. So thank you, Akhila, Guneeta,
Thank you.
Roopa, and Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.